emotional stuff it takes dealing with. I have a very good therapist who has a lot of work to do. I have crazy dreams. But I think really the main difference is I don't know when I will again do a public event which is open to the public that anybody can show up.
A life change then, but still full of writing, storytelling, and defiantly still here. Sir Salman Rushdie after the news.
I'm Debbie Rust with the BBC News. Hello. Rescue workers in South Korea are scrambling to reach people trapped inside their vehicles, submerged in an underground tunnel in the central Chungcheong region. One person is reported to have died, and at least 9 have been rescued so far. Jae Sung Lee reports.
The operation to rescue people from the tunnel is continuing throughout the night. It's still not clear how many vehicles are stranded, nor how many people are actually inside them. Earlier, there were reported to be 19 vehicles in the tunnel, but officials later corrected that to about 15. Meanwhile, there's growing criticism of the authorities, with people asking why they didn't restrict access to the tunnel sooner. Floods and landslides caused by torrential rain have killed more than 20 people over the last 3 days. South Korea's annual rainy season has become more intense in recent years as a result of rising temperatures.
Heat waves have set in around much of the northern hemisphere. The U.S. National Weather Service has warned that scorching temperatures in western states could be deadly. Unseasonably hot weather is affecting parts of China and Japan, while in Europe temperatures are nearing record levels. This British man managed to help save his grandparents' house from a wildfire near Alicante in Spain.
The field next to us is completely burnt. There's a few bits of grass just here and there towards the edges that have been able to survive, but the vast majority of it is just black and ashes. Luckily, both ourselves and the neighbour that we were helping were able to sort of save our gardens, just working as a collective.
Representatives of Sudan's army have returned to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia for peace talks. The paramilitary rivals have not confirmed if they'll rejoin the negotiations, which Saudi and US mediators adjourned last month after numerous ceasefires were violated. Sudan's health ministry said 4 people were killed in a drone attack on a hospital in Omdurman, adjoining Khartoum. South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol says he'll expand his country's humanitarian and non-lethal military support to Ukraine. Speaking in Kiev, he said Seoul would continue to supply bulletproof vests and helmets, but there was no sign of a change in policy to allow the provision of ammunition and weapons, as Ukraine is. Tennis and Marceta Vondrousova has won Wimbledon, becoming the first unseasoned title in the professional era. The 24-year-old left-hander from the Czech Republic beat Tunisia's Ons Jabeur 6-4, 6-4. Here's our tennis correspondent, Russell Fuller.
Jabeur described this as the most painful loss of her career. She appeared consumed by nerves throughout and has now lost 3 Grand Slam finals in 12 months. Vondrousova's only role at Wimbledon last year was to cheer on her best friend in the qualifying competition, with her left wrist in a cast. But after 6 months on the sidelines, has transferred her clay court prowess to the grass courts of Wimbledon.
BBC News. The Patriarch of the Chaldean Catholic Church in Iraq says he's moving his headquarters from Baghdad to Erbil in Kurdistan, amid tensions with another Christian group. The Patriarch, Mar Saka, denounced what he called a dirty game and said he was withdrawing to a monastery. Recent months have seen a growing confrontation between the Chaldean Patriarch and a Christian party whose armed wing is part of an Iranian-backed paramilitary alliance. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been taken to hospital after feeling unwell. His office says initial tests have found nothing out of the ordinary, the assessment being that he is dehydrated. Last October, the 73-year-old was also taken to hospital after feeling ill. 2 men in their late 70s have become the latest to say they were sexually assaulted while underage by the late Japanese music mogul Johnny Kitagawa. It's part of an ever-widening scandal engulfing Japan's foremost talent agency founded by Kitagawa, which in May issued an apology to those coming forward with allegations. Will Leonardo reports.
At a press conference in Tokyo, the actor Yoshitsugu Hattori and his friend spoke of being assaulted around 100 times by a man who had become one of Japan's most powerful media figures. Mr. Hattori was the son of a famous post-war singer and friend of Gianni Kitagawa. He said the abuse began when he was 8 years old. Kitagawa would stay over and assault him and his friend in his room or inside cars. Filled with fear, he said he couldn't confide in his parents. Mr. Hattori is now 78. He said he decided to come forward because of others also telling their stories. Kitagawa ran a talent agency behind many of Japan's most famous boy bands.
There's been weekend travel chaos in Italy and Belgium due to airport and airline staff strikes. Almost 250,000 travellers were left stranded in Italy after 1,000 domestic and international flights were cancelled. Ground crew want a new collective contract. BBC News.
This is the BBC World Service. I'm Razia Iqbal, and I've been speaking to the novelist Sir Salman Rushdie. By the mid-1980s, Salman Rushdie had won the Booker Prize for his novel Midnight's Children. It propelled him into international stardom. When he wrote The Satanic Verses in 1988, his life changed in a completely different way. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, issued a fatwa inciting Muslims to murder him for what he said was a book that blasphemed against Islam. Rushdie went into hiding. People demonstrated against the book. Many people were killed, including a publisher and a translator. And there were diplomatic rifts between the UK and Iran that lasted for years. For the last 20 years, he lived in relative freedom with no security protection. Last August, at a literary event in a sleepy town in upstate New York, a man walked onto the stage where Rushdie sat and stabbed him several times. This is the first interview Sir Salman Rushdie has given to the BBC since that event. I began by asking him how he was now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm all right, you know. I'm a little beaten up, but I'm kind of. I mean, the human body has an amazing capacity to heal, so I'm fortunately well on that way.
A few months after that attack, you and I exchanged some messages, and you said to me, in the end, it's the books that matter, not the knives. And it felt so typical of you to have said that, and I felt so astonished at the miracle, really, that had occurred. And I wondered, though, how you think what happened to you has changed you.
It's, I suppose, I feel, first of all, just very lucky. I discover what a lucky person I am. And then there was this huge outpouring of kind of support and affection, you know, and that was incredibly moving to feel, to be on the receiving end of that. You know? And it's a little strange because back in the day, at the moment when these threats first began, back in 1989, frankly, there wasn't so much of an outpouring of affection. There was quite a lot of the other thing.
Yeah, there was a huge amount of vilification and hate.
Yeah, and so I guess I thought this is what it takes to change people's minds.
I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about yourself as a lucky person given the threats and how long those threats had hung over your head. And for some time, you have lived without security protection and gone about your business.
Well, for 20 years, yeah, more than 20 years. And that seemed all right. Yeah. It didn't seem like I was doing something stupid. And I still don't think I was. I mean, it gave me more than 2 decades of a pretty rich life, you know, with a lot of work and a lot of joy. And I don't think that's unmade by the action of this one young man.
I want to ask you about that work in just a moment, but let's talk about that young man. Your attacker has pleaded not guilty to attempted murder. How do you feel about him?
I mean, well, first of all, that's just silly because a couple of thousand people saw him do it. And I mean, I'm led to believe that that's just a holding plea, and that actually he might well change his plea. You know? And if I was his lawyer, I would advise him to do so.
What is likely to happen? I mean, are you likely to come face to face with him in a courtroom?
It's possible. I mean, it sort of depends. I mean, if he changes his plea to guilty, then actually there's not a trial. There's just a sentencing. And it may well be that then my presence isn't required. I mean, I've actually been, I'm in two minds about it. There's one bit of me that actually wants to go and stand in the court and look at him, and there's another bit of me that just can't be bothered. You know, because I mean, as you can well understand, I don't have a very high opinion of him. And I think what is important to me now is that here I am with my life continuing, you know, and I'm more engaged with the business of that, you know, getting on with it.
And getting on with it includes writing about what happened to you?
Yeah, that's what I've been doing. I mean, it's not going to be a long book. It'll be, you know, a couple of 100 pages maybe.
And is that because you can't do anything before you've dealt with that, do you think?
Yes, because initially I wasn't sure that I would write about it. You know, and I actually had another idea in mind, like before the attack and all that I thought might be a next thing. And I went back at the point at which I was able to start thinking about writing again. I went back to the computer file where I put my notes on that idea. And I looked at it and I just thought, this is silly, I can't do this. You know, it's like, I mean, to use the cliche, there's this colossal elephant in the room. And until I deal with that, it's difficult to take seriously anything else. You know, and so I thought, well, okay, then I'd better deal with it.
And has security for you changed since the attack? I mean, presumably your family are particularly nervous about all of that.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's nervous. More nervous than me, actually.
Why is that? Why are you less nervous?
I've had 33 years. And I kind of understand what's happening, and I know how to deal with it. I mean, the answer is yes, it has changed. And in America, I've got involved with private security and there are occasions when I have to use that. And in England, I mean, I've been offered protection again, and so for the moment, anyway, I have that. You know, when I'm in England.
And is that state protection?
Yeah. Like the good old days.
It is extraordinary that you can joke about these things. I mean, that also feels typical of you.
Well, you know, I mean, Indira just died, and I've been thinking about him. He talked about laughter as being the way to deal with atrocity. Of course, in his case, the atrocity he's speaking of is communism and, you know, and so on. But I think it's not bad advice.
Your last novel, your latest novel, Victory City, was finished before the attack happened. It does, though, feel to me like a book that affirms time and again your faith in literature.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book about a book, you know. It's a book that its anonymous narrator is adapting from another book, which of course doesn't exist, which is an ancient text. So yeah, it's a book about loving books, you know, and it's a book about the way in which books, in the end, tell us the world. Writers don't have much power, you know. We don't have armies, and we don't have billions, and we don't have twitters and threads. What we do have is the ability to write about the world in the way that will, if we're any good at it, that might endure, you know. So it's like if we now think about Napoleon Bonaparte's Russian campaign, we think about War and Peace, you know? And in a way, Tolstoy owns that more than any historian, even though he took terrible liberties and changed things around, you know, etc.
It is interesting to hear you say that writers don't have power, and yet your words have provoked diplomatic rifts. The threat over you, of course, has been considerable. People have lost their lives as a result of the response to words that you wrote.
Yeah, I mean, people lost their lives as a response to a terrorist fascist attack. I mean, let's get this the right way around. And I wish it weren't so. But I also find it very difficult to believe that it was my words that had the power, because almost everybody who attacked the book failed to read it. So the attack was against an imaginary book and with real-world consequences. It's one of the bizarre aspects of it. But I mean, one of the things that's been good about this long period since the publication of the Satanic Verses is that people are able to read the book now. And I mean, that was one reason to fight for its survival. I hoped that a time would arrive, which I think more or less has arrived, when people could read it as a novel, not as some kind of political hot potato, and some people love it, some people don't like it, and some people are halfway in between, and that's the ordinary life of a book, and I just wanted that book, like all my other books, to have its ordinary life, and I'm happy to say that I think now it has it, and it was a big fight, but it was a good one to have.
Do you think, though, that in the wake of the attack last year, people did talk about how the Satanic Verses may not have been published today? So different is the culture and our sensitivities around Islam.
Yeah, I mean, that might be true. That might be true. I mean, I have no way of knowing, really. And I would hope it's not true. But it's very difficult to ask what if, and I remember my old history teachers at Cambridge saying to me that it was hard enough to understand what actually happened without asking yourself what might have happened if that hadn't happened. And the art of history is to examine what actually did happen. And what didn't happen but might have or could happen another, that's for fiction.
Indeed, and it's exactly what you do in Victory City, your latest novel. I mean, the hero and author is a woman who lives till she's 247 years old. She becomes a queen, founding a city which is a sort of feminist utopia, if you like, but then it becomes distinctly illiberal.
Yeah.
And I wonder about that in the context of everything that you're saying, because you are clearly an observer of what has shifted in society in terms of the ease with which illiberalness can emerge.
Yeah, well, one of the things, when I was doing the research for what became Victory City, reading about the medieval Indian kingdom of Vijayanagar in South India, which is sort of what inspired it, one of the things that really struck me was how central and important the place of women was, in the 14th century, that there were almost as many schools for girls as for boys, that there were women in every walk of life. There were women generals, and merchants and lawyers and anything you can imagine, And I thought, how interesting that was true 700 years ago. And if you look at contemporary India, it's maybe less true now than it was then. And so that became one of the starting points for the book. But I'm not by nature very utopian. I'm more of a satirist than a utopian. And so I thought, well, obviously things are going to go wrong. and it's interesting how they would go wrong. But they don't just go wrong in one direction. There are phases. There are bits when they go right again, and then they go wrong again. And one of the things that I learned through the study of history is that history does a straight line. It circles about in spirals and loops, and there are enormous changes very suddenly. And if you're really going to write about history, you have to write about that. And that's, of course, a very novelistic way of thinking.
After the fatwa, you wrote a book which was really an allegory looking at the fight for freedom of speech, Haroun in the Sea of Stories, which you wrote for your son, and I'm interested in that being the book that you chose to write after that thing that happened to you and the book that you feel you have to write now after the attack on you last year. I mean, on this issue of not being silenced, that feels central to your life as an intellectual and as a writer now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true of all of us, you know, who do this strange work, that there are forces trying to silence people, and it's true all over the world. And it's perhaps more true right at this moment than at many points in my life, I think. You know, yeah, I mean, Haroun and the Sea of Stories, I mean, I have to say, truthfully, is just about my favorite book of mine.
Funnily enough, it's my favorite book of yours too. I absolutely adore it.
And it was written because I had a young son. You know, he was 10, 11, 10. He was 10, not even 10 years old when the attack happened. And I had promised him I was going to write a book for him, so I thought I'd better keep the promise, you know, and it turned out to be that book. And so it was, you know, it was a very emotional book to write because it had that intimate aspect to it. And then it came out, and I actually must say, I understood why people who write for young readers have such a nice time, because you know, because the response you get from young people is so magical. You know, I mean, I would get letters from entire classrooms of kids who'd read Haroun the Sea of Stories, in which they would draw pictures of the characters, and they would tell me who they liked and who they didn't like, and they would give me ideas for sequels, and so on. You know, and it was just the most fun I've ever had.
That's so wonderful. It's amazing. I mean, I wonder, though, about what you make of how difficult it still feels to us in British society, in European society, in American society, to really deal with any situation where Islam is perceived to have been slighted in some way, whether it's in France, the murder of the teacher being beheaded because he showed cartoons. In this country, a teacher went into hiding after showing students cartoons of the Prophet. I mean, I wonder why you think we still don't really know how to approach what feels very, very difficult still, so sensitive.
Well, I just think you've got to distinguish between people's private faith, you know, which is kind of none of our business, really, you know, and the politicization of any religion, kind of weaponization of religion, to act upon all of us, you know, and you just have to make that distinction. I mean, it's not just Islam. I mean, in America right now, you've got a highly weaponized version of Christianity, which was responsible, in very large part, responsible for the reversal of Roe versus Wade, you know, and for the whole abortion debate. So I just, in my mind, I think it's actually not that complicated, you know. It seems to me, I mean, I'm not a religious person. I never have been. I came from a family that wasn't particularly religious, and we did all right. And my view is, I don't need it. It's not a thing I need for myself, you know. But if there are people who need it, I mean, that's their business, not mine. You know, until it becomes politicized. When it becomes politicized, it becomes everybody's business, as all political things do. You know? And I think we just have to be clear about that distinction. So the kind of person who goes off and chooses violence, you know, in my view, is not a representative of religion. He's a representative of violence, you know, and has to that way. Maybe just if we can keep it clear in our heads that there's this distinction between the private practice of religion and politicized religion, maybe that gives us a way of thinking about it.
I must say that you look very relaxed and at ease in your skin. And when we met last week in London, you were here supporting your wife, who has published her debut novel. And I wonder what that feels like, to be in a place where You actually look very happy to me.
Yeah, well, I am pretty happy, apart from one thing, which was, as you say, almost a year ago, and was a terrible thing. But yeah, I mean, it was very nice to come. I'm going to give her a plug. I promise, Rachel Eliza Griffiths. It's an amazing book, published by John Murray last week. Buy that book. And no, I mean, I think it would be difficult, wouldn't it, for two writers to live together if they didn't like each other's work. And I mean, it wouldn't happen. And the fact that, you know, we've now been together for 7 years or something, and at the beginning, I mean, I think she was a little scared to show me what she was writing, and I was a little scared to read it. But as it happened, it was the moment she did show me, it was very easy, because the book, before this book, there was also a really beautiful work of poetry called Seeing the Body, which is inspired by her mother's death, and just incredible poetic investigation of grief and loss, you know, and love. And then this novel just blew me away. You know, I just thought, this is an extraordinary writer. And I think one of the infallible tests for whether a book is, whether you like a book or not, is whether it inspires envy. You think, how do you do that? You know, I say to her often now that living with a poet is a little humbling because of their command of language. So yeah, it's a very beautiful book, and I hope it will find its readers.
We are approaching the first anniversary of this brutal attack against you. I mean, I wonder how you feel you are now moving in the world. Do you feel that you are the same as you were before, apart from, obviously, the physical impact of what happened?
Yeah, I mean, actually, the physical stuff is more or less okay. You know, I mean, with the exception of having lost an eye. You know, but otherwise, the physical stuff is reasonably all right. You know, the emotional stuff it takes dealing with. I mean, I have a very good therapist who has a lot of work to do, and I have crazy dreams. But I think really the main difference is I don't know when I will again do a public event which is open to the public, that anybody can show up. You know. As opposed to an invitation event, and, you know, things that are more controllable. Because, you know, Chautauqua is the sleepiest place in the world. You know, it's a very pretty place with a community of essentially liberal retirees. You know, so the audience is that. You know, and it's a very nice, open-minded, older audience. And that's who was sitting in the crowd, you know. And in the middle of that, there was this one, much younger, much less open-minded individual who was able to attack me. And I don't know when I'm going to put myself in that position again.
And that was Sir Salman Rushdie speaking from his home in New York. I'm Razia Iqbal. Thanks for listening to this special edition of the documentary.
This is the BBC World Service, where Natasha Loder is examining the challenges we face from long COVID.
COVID's trail of destruction to human health is only gradually becoming fully apparent.
At first, when I got COVID, I thought I'd be back after 10 days. Then it was a month. Then I started to think 3 months.
I'll be hearing from scientists trying to unravel a condition with around 200 symptoms.
Long COVID is a health crisis.
And finding out what the latest research on some sufferers is showing.
When we exercise participants and we walk them up and down just for 6 minutes and we do blood tests at the end, their blood looks like they've run the London Marathon.
Depression, psychosis, sleep disturbances are mostly reported by women.
The long haul of long COVID at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries or wherever you get your podcasts.
Coming up on Outlook, Hannah Bourne-Taylor has always been bird obsessed.
So when she came across an abandoned baby finch, instinct kicked in.
I chirped at the finch, and when he chirped back, I was accepted almost instantaneously as a surrogate mother to this finch.
Hannah had been going through a mental health crisis, but each day with the bird proved to be exactly what she needed. The life-changing power of nature after the news.
BBC News with David Harper. Rescue workers in South Korea are scrambling through the night to reach people trapped inside their vehicles, submerged in an underground tunnel in the central Chungcheong region. So far, one person has been found dead and 9 people have been pulled out alive. It's unclear how many cars are trapped. Heat waves have now set in around much of the northern hemisphere. Nearly a third of Americans are under extreme advisories, with warnings that scorching temperatures in the west could be deadly to anyone without effective cooling or hydration. In La Palma, in the Canaries, at least 2,000 people have been evacuated as a forest fire burned out of control. Sudan's army has sent negotiators back to Saudi Arabia for peace talks. Their paramilitary rivals, the RSF, have not confirmed if they'll rejoin the negotiations. South Korea is to increase humanitarian and non-lethal military aid to Ukraine. President Yoon Suk-yeol said during a visit to Kiev he would continue to supply bulletproof vests and helmets. However, there was no sign of change in policy to allow the provision of lethal weapons requested by Ukraine. Strikes of airport and airline staff have disrupted weekend travel in Italy and Belgium. In Italy, 1,000 flights were cancelled. 2 men in their late 70s have become the latest to say they were sexually assaulted while underage by the late Japanese music mogul Johnny Kitagawa. It's part of an ever-widening scandal engulfing Japan's foremost talent agency, which he founded. Tennis, and Marketa Vondrousova has won Wimbledon, becoming the first unseeded player to win the women's singles title in the professional era. The 24-year-old left-hander from the Czech Republic beat Tunisia's Ons Jabeur 6-4, 6-4. Public sector workers in Brazil will be allowed time off to watch the women's national football team matches during the World Cup, which starts on Thursday. The decision was announced after Brazil's left-wing government came under criticism since it's an established practice for the men's World Cup. BBC News.
Hello, it's Emily Webb here, and this is Outlook. Look, people from around the world share the most extraordinary moments of their lives. When Hannah Bourne-Taylor was struggling with her mental health and extreme anxiety and just trying to make it through each day, a small wild bird came into her life. For 84 days, they spent every waking hour together, with the bird even nesting in Hannah's hair. The experience would be transformative. Hannah's a British writer and conservationist, and I found it hard not to get caught up in her enthusiasm. She is bird-obsessed, her words, not mine, and told me about one of her favourite species.
Swifts spend their lives between southern Africa and Britain and Europe, and the summer months are when the swifts come back to Britain. And so I have been running around my village as a 35-year-old woman, telling everyone at the top of my voice, they've arrived, they've arrived.
I love this. So I've actually been following you on Twitter, and there are these amazing videos where you're just like, oh my gosh, the swifts are back.
They're back. The swifts are back. There was 4. They've just done a flyby just right over my head. I've been going completely bonkers, like looking up at the sky.
You're just so excited by it.
If you had to define joy for me as a person living a life right now, it is the swifts and their return and how remarkable these birds are. They shriek around. They've got these iconic silhouettes. They do these aerial displays that are better than the red arrows. And so as a child, it was very, very obvious that, of course, I wanted to be a part of their lives. And so as a kid, you kind of get away with it. It's okay for a 7-year-old to run around sort of trying to pretend to be a swift and jumping up and down. That's what I used to do. I used to run after them and try and leap into the air and normally fall on my back and end up counting how many there were. And so I had grown up with these swifts in my childhood in Somerset.
Also, where in Somerset are you from? I'm from Somerset.
Oh, right. My parents currently live near Crewkerne.
Oh, near Crewkerne. Oh, very nice. Oh, my associations with Somerset are more like going out on Weston-super-Mares, so
oh my god.
So you were like, oh, the beautiful swifts, and I was like, meanwhile. Because I read that you described that you have this kind of tunnel vision when it comes to the natural world. Where does that come from, do you think?
I've always been a lover of the wild and of animals, so I think that was partly to do with my parents. So I spent a lot of time outside. We didn't have a television, and we spent most of our time walking around out in the countryside, looking at the hedgerows, and my father would start telling me these magical facts that would differentiate each species from the next. And I just started falling in love with these different lives around us. And I also felt like an odd one out at school. And so every time I felt like the odd one out, I would sort of go back to nature. And also we moved around a lot. And every time we moved, it would be the garden that was my anchor of home, because in the garden, it was the blackbird and the robin and those familiar faces that would be wherever I moved to. And so this idea, I didn't know that until I went to Ghana.
And Hannah's time in Ghana is what we're going to be talking about. That's where Hannah stumbled across an abandoned fledgling finch that she decided to raise and release back into the wild. Hannah was living in a very remote part of Ghana at the time, in the southeastern region of the country.
So imagine just all you can see is grassland that is above your head.
How was it that you first came across the finch?
Oh, the finch. So imagine a bird about half the size of a sparrow.
Probably what, like smaller than a fist?
Oh, yeah. So if he was standing in my hand, he would be about the height of my little finger, maybe a little bit more. Okay. The finch is a mannequin, a bronze-winged mannequin finch. So mannequin, that word derives from Flemish, meaning little man. So just imagine this tiny little thing. And these are flock birds. They live on the edge of existence for their whole lives. So their lives are measured in weeks and months, because basically they're a flying snack. You know, they're tiny. They're at the bottom rung of the food chain. And so they are always talking to each other, because their survival technique is to stay in the flock. So the sort of herd mentality of safer in numbers.
What do finches sound like?
Oh, so they have lots of different calls. I can only do the generic chirp, so that kind of thing. And so they chirp all the time, especially the babies at this time of year. These fledglings are chirping. And so the mannequin flock would swirl around my house, and they have these nests that they make out of the grass stems, and they put them up in the mango trees. And after a gigantic thunderstorm, all of these nests came down. They got blown out of the tree, and the next morning it looked like tumbleweed. All the nests were on the muddy ground. The mannequin flock were nowhere to be seen. And looked at these nests, and I found one fledgling, one little tiny little thing. And this fledgling had his head bowed and his eyes shut, and he was shaking, so I knew he was alive. And I didn't want to meddle in his life. You know, it's very, very difficult to look after wild animals, and it's always better if the parents can do it themselves. I didn't want to intervene. And often you can want to help, and actually it's the wrong thing to do, especially for fledgling birds. They're often being taught a lesson in independence by their parents and are deliberately left on their own, things like that. So I sort of left it, hoping that its parents would reclaim the bird, and I sort of spied on it for a good day. But by dusk, I knew the cobras would come and eat it, wouldn't survive the night. So yeah, by dusk, I had picked this fledgling up and was walking back to my house, having no idea what to do with it, and also no idea that it would turn into this love story of epic proportions.
The timing here was crucial, because it was a moment when both the finch and Hannah needed help. Hannah had moved to Ghana from London in her late 20s with her husband, who worked in education. They lived in the capital, Accra, initially, and to say that she struggled to settle in would be an understatement.
I had been living in Zone 1, central London. I had a job in the creative industry, and every single minute of my life was accounted for. If I wasn't on the tube going to work, I was at work or at a meeting, and if I wasn't doing those two things, I would be having a social drink, social whatever. Like, I was never alone, and I didn't realise that maybe that wasn't particularly healthy, because everybody else was doing that too. You know, young 20-something life is incredibly full. Social butterfly, work commitments, yo-yoing between everything all the time. And I think that was actually the root of the problem.
Was there a moment when you moved to Ghana and you thought, uh-oh, I'm really in trouble here?
Yeah, there was an uh-oh moment. I think it was probably about after 30 days of crying every day was probably the realization. I mean, when I got to Ghana, firstly, all of those layers of other people just vanished. So I didn't have that work layer, that social layer, and that time purpose layer. And so without those things, I became this sort of hollow shell of a person and just didn't know, firstly, what to do with myself, and secondly, who I was. And then I realized gradually, despairingly, that I actually really hadn't known who I was for, well, maybe ever. And the more time I spent on my own, the more vulnerable and awkward I became. And that's when I started severely suffering from anxiety and obsessive compulsions and things. So since I was about 8, I've had OCD. I didn't know what OCD was until I was in my 20s, so I lived with it, having no idea that it was a thing, but I had managed to hide it from everybody, including myself, really, all the way through my 20s, have managed it so that it was sort of simmering on the edge of normal. And so then when it popped up again, like a sinister jack-in-the-box, I wasn't expecting it. I thought I was sort of over the worst.
So when the obsessive-compulsive disorder kicked in, how did it manifest?
So to start with, it was what I actually still do, which is check lights and taps aren't running or on. It's very difficult because that might sound like I'm just a sort of eco-warrior, but it was also this idea that it was suffering, it shouldn't be on. So I sort of ensouled these elements, and I'd always ensouled lots of things through my childhood, like tins of beans being the wrong way up, like shoelaces being under shoes, and therefore they would be sort of suffocating and therefore suffering. So I'd have to take them out.
You used the word ensouled. So when you were young and you were like making sure shoelaces weren't under shoes and stuff, was the idea that actually these shoelaces had a soul? That's what you mean by it, and that you therefore needed to rescue them?
Yes, it's a term. Ensouling means that you're ensouling an inanimate object. And I'm not the only person who does it, and it's so amazing to know that. Then it really hit home. The real confrontational OCD, an unmistakable OCD element came when we moved to this dilapidated mansion, which sounds amazing, actually. And it was a beautiful place. And we were there because it was going to be demolished, and everyone else didn't want to live in it because it was, a bit decrepit. But I saw and fell in love with the garden, and there were mature palm trees and mango trees, and also the swimming pool. And I thought, oh, great, smug cliche, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to swan around in this swimming pool. And it went wrong. Like, into days it went wrong. So I dressed into my bikini, dived into the swimming pool, thought, oh, this is great, it's amazing. And then I noticed the ants falling into the swimming pool. And I noticed their eyes and how I could actually see their eyes, and how there's something about being able to make eye contact with another creature. It's a real leveler. And so I suddenly kind of felt like I understood their perspective, and what was happening was that they were falling into the pool, and they were able to swim, but the problem is they couldn't get out of the swimming pool, and so they were drowning, and they were drowning en masse. And obviously they were drowning in silence because they don't make a noise. And so this idea of suffering and it being actually real, it wasn't in my head, this was happening, these lives were dying because of my swimming pool, and because I was there noticing them, I felt like it was absolutely my responsibility to save them. So I would save to the point where I couldn't leave the pool, to the point where I wasn't swimming anymore. I was putting fronds of the palms into the pool and making these rafts, but then I couldn't leave it at that, thinking, okay, well, they'll get up onto the raft. I would want to check to make sure that they were getting up onto the raft, or if they weren't, managing to scoot them out anyway, to the point where I was patrolling in the night as well as the day. So I got completely sucked into the swimming pool. It made me have a sort of panic attack that would turn physical, so my mind would just be ablaze with this alarming desire to do it. And if I didn't, I just couldn't cope with the idea. It was unbearable for me. And actually I ended up saving lots of different creatures, and it became incredibly worthwhile. It made me feel like I was doing something useful in my own little tiny life that had sort of been forgotten, and also fueled the OCD like mad.
Yeah. You were living in Accra, and you then moved to this more rural part of Ghana. Can you describe the effect that that move had on you?
Yes, so we moved after a couple of years to a remote grassland about 3 hours from life as we knew it. Luckily, there were these amazing, colourful birds all over the place, and one particular bird, not colourful, but one that I recognised innately as part of my own identity, the swift, because of course I had grown up with these swifts in my childhood throughout England, and then there I was plonked in this incredibly remote landscape, very alien environment to me, but there were these birds that were completely a part of my own identity from Britain. And so I latched onto these birds almost as soon as we moved.
And not just swifts, but also finches. Because this is where Hannah discovered the tiny brown bird on the muddy ground without a nest or a flock.
As soon as I had picked this bird up, he did this thing which is called imprinting, which is basically when a young bird, and also some young animals do it, where they instinctively, as a survival technique, will accept the thing that is sort of near them. So normally it's obviously supposed to be their biological parent, but you see these videos online of ducklings following golden retrievers and things like that. That's because the ducklings have decided that the golden retriever, who was nearby when they were super young, is effectively their mother or father. And so I was accepted almost instantaneously as a surrogate mother to this finch.
So he moved in to your house with you and your husband. You sort of had rescued this finch, but what did you want to do with it?
So firstly, I wanted the bird to keep alive. I wanted to save his life, which is actually really hard to do. A lot of people try and keep alive baby birds. It's really difficult to keep them alive. But I had a much bigger purpose. I wanted to put his life back on course. I wanted to return him to the wild and reunite him with his family. And a part of that was because actually I felt really lost, and I felt like that's what I would want for myself. And I was trying to figure out how I could find myself and how I could get my life back on course, and that governed every minute of my day. It was quite stressful.
Because this finch was a fledgling, meaning that he was a very young bird and hadn't learned all of the skills yet to leave the nest, so you would have to sort of train him up, teach him all of those skills. How much time were you spending with the finch every day, and how were you just keeping him alive?
So I spent every waking hour with the finch. So 12 hours every day, so that's 84 days. It was 1,000 hours together. So firstly, I had to figure out how to feed him and keep him feeding. It's quite ironic.
Ironic in what way?
Well, I said earlier about how I spent hours and hours and hours saving ants and other insects from the pool and being completely obsessed. Well, then I had to change tack and realised the best way to keep him alive was protein. And so termites were the answer, collecting them and feeding this finch, these enormous termites. And the reward was instantaneous. So when he was hungry, which pretty much all the time, he would throw his head back and have this shrill alarm demanding hunger call. Feed me now. And he'd whip out his wings, he'd gulp it down straight away, and he would just keep on doing this alarm until he suddenly became full and then would sort of topple over in this extreme sleep, a bit like, after we've had a massive Christmas dinner perhaps, and we all sort of go on the sofa. So like that, but like all the time.
I also love that sometimes he was so desperate to be fed that he would just fall over with his enthusiasm.
Yeah, he was like a little matador having a tantrum, or a little opera singer, not able to keep quite on his toes. And the best one, he would make these nests in my hair, actually conveniently because he was instinctively practicing, and my very long waist-long hair is very similar to the stems of grass that they make their nests out of anyway. And so he would curl my hair up, and then once he was tired, he would sort of nestle into the nest he'd made. He always wanted to be close, skin on feather. And then he would settle down and he would sort of relax his body, and I'd feel this tiny little weight, a feathered pom-pom, breathing quietly, nestling in my collarbone. And then he would make this incredible, very soft chirp. He sounded like a cat purring almost. And that was his communication that he was content. And that's what made me fall for him completely. Because here was this wild bird who had been born from a tiny egg the size of our little fingernail in a high-up tree. And there he was with me, sort of comforted by the sound of my voice and the beat of my heart, nestling in my own hair. And, I just loved him so much.
OCD had really taken hold of your life in this quite intense way after you first arrived in Ghana. Did you notice a difference after the arrival of the finch? Did it make a difference to your OCD?
Yeah, massively, almost straight away. And the reason was, quite simply, that I had no time. All of my nervous, insane and sane energy into one life, this finch, I was completely wrapped up in that. But yeah, I couldn't do any of those OCD things. And actually, by not doing the OCD thing, by not checking things and these rituals happening, actually creating space between doing it, the less I felt compelled to have these routines in the first place. Also, though, living in the perspective of a tiny wild bird at the bottom of the food chain in the wild, wild Africa, it doesn't half change your perspective on life and on life choices and daily things. You know, there I was trying desperately to think like a finch and be more like him because I had to rewild him. So my focus became, how on earth was I going to teach this bird how to survive in this incredibly harsh wild environment outside? I certainly couldn't be worrying about the future.
The key to your success basically was getting the finch accepted as part of this flock, because as you say, it's very much safety in numbers if you're a little finch in the world. How did you try to get him accepted?
Okay, so there's some basic steps that I had to figure out to start with. So fundamentally, he had to know that he was a finch and not some feathered human like me. He wasn't a pet, that's why I didn't name him. He was outside as much as he could be, like all the time. I wanted him to be able to see the flock so that he could be copying what they were doing. So these fledglings in flock birds, they learn from observing the elders around them. And so he didn't really know how to eat the grass, but I knew that he would if he watched the other ones doing it. And so that was my purpose. It wasn't so much to make friends with them at that stage. It was just so that he could copy them and be finch, do what they did. And doing what they did meant that I had to keep putting him back on the grass stems, inching nearer to the flock so that he could study what they were doing. So the flock had a set routine that I learned, and they would be in the grasslands at a certain time of day, but then they would go onto the short grass and start hopping around, eating the little gnats and the little leaf bugs for their protein intake. And then if they needed a drink, they would never go to the big river because that would be too risky for them. So they would find palms that had sort of kept little puddles of water within their frost, these secret places that only they knew, and I knew that the finch would only know if the finch was sort of told by them. And so a lot of spying and stalking was done from my point of view to kind of collect this intel.
So the release date approach, you'd done all of this work with the finch, and you were due to be flying back to the UK. And so you decided that it would actually be better if your husband was the person who released the finch, because you were more attached to the finch and he might not go as willingly. What was your goodbye like?
So basically every night for 3 months, at the end of the days, I would say goodnight to him, and it was sort of like a lullaby situation, when you read your children bedtime stories and kind of get them all tucked up and maybe stroke their heads, that sort of thing. Really, really loving part of the day, very tender. And I would do that with the finch, so he would love to be stroked, especially the side of his head. And he would start to lull to one side and his eyes would droop. And so that was the last time I saw him. I did that. And the only difference was that I knew that I was never going to see him again, or if I did, it wouldn't be in the same situation. And so I said goodbye to him, and that particular time, it was as if he knew maybe something, because he really didn't settle very well and he kept wanting more strokes. And, I kept sort of being quite sentimental at that point and, telling him I loved him and whispering it was going to be okay. And, imagine just abandoning your dog when you didn't want to. It's like that, except for he was wild, and that was the difference. But he didn't feel wild. He felt like my baby. So, I said goodbye to him, goodnight, feeling so like I was betraying him because, of course, he didn't know what was going on. It was a horrible plan coming to the fore, and he had no idea. So I felt horrible, guilty as anything.
It must have been such an agonizing waiting to hear from your husband how the release had gone.
Yeah, as soon as I got off the plane, for example, I phoned up Robin, and without saying hello, I was like, where's the bird? What's happened? Worrying that he'd been released and it was already dead or lost in the wild. And that didn't happen, luckily, because I don't know what I'd have done otherwise. But it did take a couple of days. And then he did it. He made it. Just a casual mobile phone conversation. It means absolutely everything to me. This news coming. Robin explained what had happened and how the bird had been really reluctant for a few days. Robin had taken him out, sort of offered him up to the flock, so to speak. And the bird hadn't quite known what to do, didn't quite know. And on the 4th day, he went with them and he flew high. He flew high and strong. It wasn't just a little skip and a jump with the flock. He flew high with them, over back to roost with them, and he'd done it.
Where were you when he told you that?
So I was I'm really glad I was where I was. I was up in a top meadow in Oxfordshire with the wind in my hair, looking up at the sky, really, feeling very emotional, just like I do now, really, because it is such a big deal. And when I heard the news, I sort of just stared upwards and thought of this bird who had become such a part of who I am. He had redefined my identity, he had changed my outlook on life, and he had done it. He had actually made it. And so for me, I felt like a part of me had made that too. He has stayed a part of me, the strongest part of me and the most loving part of me. And there he was, wild again.
You told me about the sort of day-to-day changes, like with your OCD, how looking after this finch had really, really helped you day to day and deal with all those things. Did it feel like looking after the finch had actually made a more profound change in you?
Yeah, every ounce of me has changed, I feel. So, this is why I decided to write a book. I wouldn't have written about my OCD in the book if I didn't think it was an important part of it and how it linked together. And it felt really, really liberating, because admitting it to myself had been a hurdle I had stuck with and not done for 25 years. I hadn't told my husband I had OCD until I was 32. And then suddenly I was writing about it in my book because it felt so important to explain that this finch had changed my life, and my life actually needed changing. I had quite big mental health problems. I was also just fundamentally lost, and I think a lot of people are maybe putting the wrong emphasis on what they're chasing. And I really wanted to share this essence of how connecting with nature, and you don't have to have a bird in your hair for 84 days, you don't have to do this extreme thing that I did. You can just connect. As a result of the finch, I am now doing all sorts of things in England. I'm a conservationist. I'm writing about that now. I feed a flock of farmland birds, all of which are on the red list of highest conservation concern, all of which who remind me of the finch every day. So I do these things, and it's all because of this one little bird.
So I read this quote of something that your husband said to you before you moved to Ghana. He said, "Don't worry, it'll be great. You'll love the birds." Do you ever joke about that with him?
Yeah, that's why I put him in the acknowledgements, the very, very last sentence of the book. In some ways, that's the whole book. It's just that one sentence. Don't worry, you'll be fine, you'll love the birds. Well, yeah, that turns out it took 7 years. He was right. Thanks, Robin. And I do. I love the birds. I'm a complete bird lover, bird obsessed.
You did go back to Ghana after the release of the finch, and you went to where that flock of birds all hung out near your house, and you went to look for him. What happened?
What happened was I was looking for the flock. I was seeing all the different birds, found the flock. They were coming back to roost in the mango trees outside my house, and couldn't, no idea which one he was, whether he was alive, just didn't know. And then one bird circled back round and perched on the nearest branch he could get to me. And they don't do that, wild birds do not do that, completely unprecedented. And that's because that was my finch. He looked at me, he inspected me, he's cocked his head, I chirped, he chirped, and then he flew away. And actually, he did that a few times, and it was the most incredible satisfaction of, the proudest moment in my life, reuniting with this bird. But at the same time, there was bittersweetness, because, of course, my instinct was to sort of hug him and love him and tell him I missed him and catch up and have him back in my hand, back in my hair, feel the feathers and the skin together. And, of course, I didn't get that. But that was the reward of him being wild. So
when was the last time you saw him?
Just before we left Ghana. I'd love to imagine him still alive. There's a possibility that he is alive. I like to think that he is. It was a while ago now, but it will never fade as a memory.
Writer and bird lover Hannah Bourne-Taylor. And if you're struggling with your mental health, there's more information and resources available online. Go to bbc.co.uk/actionline or befrienders.org.
This is the BBC World Service asking, can Bangladesh's clothing industry go green and still keep costs down?
Bangladesh has positioned itself as a country where clothes are made in a more environmentally friendly way. But green technology comes at a price. So who's paying for it?
Bangladesh's clothing conundrums at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries or wherever you get your podcasts.